So I'm going to assemble a few more parts of the loader, and you can follow along if you have the parts done, or you can come back to these later. So I'm just going to open it up, a new standard assembly. The other day we assembled the cab onto the loader, but I'll just start with the chassis here by itself. As soon as it loads. And I'll ground it in place as I did before. So here's the chassis, and obviously the cab goes on top like we did the other day. The hood goes behind the chassis. The support goes in front of the, or excuse me, behind the cab. The support goes in front of it, and you use offset constraints and mate and flush constraints just like we did for doing the cab the other day. But then when you get to putting the wheels on, you got to use some different techniques. So I'm going to place here 2 copies of the axle that are going to hold the wheels onto the chassis. And then I have to put them into the holes that are on the chassis. In order to put a round object into a hole, you can use a different kind of constraint than what we've used before. That's called the insert constraint. So this 4th constraint right here in the list is the insert constraint, and it allows you to align any 2 circular features together. So if I hover over the axle here, you can see it shows a dotted line where the center axis of the circular feature is, and it shows the edge of the circular feature. If I click on that and then I click on the hole, it'll put that axle right up against that hole. Now there's 2 kinds of solutions, just like there are for mate constraints. There's where they're opposed or facing each other, or there's where they're aligned, which is like a flush constraint. So if I switch it to aligned, it'll move the axle so that it's inside the chassis. However, it's still not where I want it to go because it's not sticking out on one side. It's only sticking out on the other side. In order to do that, I have to add another offset constraint, and I'm going to offset it half the difference between the width of the axle and the width of the chassis. Now I remember that the width width of the chassis was 2 1/8, and the axle, I forget exactly how long that is. Let me go into that and check. The axle is 2 11/16 inches long. So I can actually just use Inventor to do all the math for me. I finished the constraint, so I'm going back into it here and adding a dimension for an offset. And I'm just going to have Inventor do all the math. So I'm going to type in, inside parentheses, 2 11/16 minus 2 1/8. So that's going to be the difference between the axle and the chassis. And then I'm going to divide that by 2. Now it's still not correct, but that's okay because there's just one small thing I have to change. It pushed it further into the hole. So if I change my offset to be a negative value, it'll pull it back out the hole. And now when I look at it from the front view, or from the side, you can see that the axle is evenly spaced between both sides of the chassis. The rear axle would be done the same way, choosing an insert constraint. It's going to be an aligned insert constraint, and then the difference between the two, or the offset, is going to be 2 11/16 minus 2 1/8 divided by 2, and a negative in front of all of that. And now I've got both axles inserted into the chassis. Now to put the wheels on the chassis, I just simply have to go to place and choose the wheel parts. I'll just do one of them for now. You're going to use an insert constraint again for the wheels. What's very important when you put the wheels on, though, is that you choose the right two circular features that are going to be lined up. So I'll choose the constraint and I'll choose insert. But I want to choose two circular features that are going to be in the same plane when it's assembled. So for instance, if I would choose the outside of the wheel here, it's going to not be in the right place on the axle. It's going to be flush with this circle right here on the wheel and the end of the axle. So I'll choose this circle here and then the end of the axle. I want it to be an aligned constraint again, so I click on that. And then you can see the way it's aligned, it goes right there on the end of the axle. And there's still a small gap between the chassis and the wheel, otherwise the wheel would rub against the chassis. The last detail is the button that goes on top of the wheel. It looks like a hub for the wheel. And if you were actually building this out of wood, you would just glue the button on the end of the axle inside the assembly here. And if we're assembling it here in Inventor, we can again use an insert constraint. Even though it's not going inside anything, it's aligning two circular features. So I can click on this circular edge here, and then on the inside of the wheel, this circular edge here, and that'll align it right in place where it's supposed to be. Now it's hard to tell because there's no texture on this wheel, but this wheel still is free to move. If I change this texture to have a wood grain texture, so that we can see the texture a little bit, I can actually click on this wheel and pull it around, and it actually rotates about that axis, which is what we would want a wheel to do. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's some pointers and tips about how to assemble the wheels and the axles onto the chassis in the loader project.